This is a gift to all of those people out there who see that the climate is changing, that life around us is being destroyed, and that our society is on the brink of collapse. This is an offering to each and every one of you listening who has something to give, who knows that you have a beautiful contribution to this symphony of regeneration, to make the world a better place. But maybe you haven't found your instrument yet, and you haven't yet joined the orchestration. Today, we have an episode with Brianna from Reneum, and felt like a resounding call to action to all of the people out there who want to make a difference. The tools are here, the time is now, and the narrative is clear that we all have a very unique and important place in making the world a better space for our children and for the generations to come. Before we drop the episode with Brianna, Simar, is there anything that you're looking forward to sharing?
Man, I think you hit it so beautifully, John. I think one of the things that we touch on today is the importance of personal agency, in everything that's happening around us. It's so hard sometimes to know what to do and to feel helpless with everything going on. And so, Brianna is amazing. What she's doing is amazing. And it feels like in the exploration of the renewable energy markets and everything that she's working on, I feel like one of the things that has been most resonant for me is just how much community there is, how much there is for us to give and to do, and ways to reclaim our own agency, even as all this is happening. And so I'm just really excited to be in that exploration today with Brianna, through her story as a lens to seeing how we can all show up to this dance, show up to this orchestra, and give our gifts to create a more beautiful world that we know is possible. How are you doing today, Brianna? What's present for you? How are you feeling?
I'm doing great, thank you. I'm so excited to be on here. Thank you, Simar. We just had a beautiful 2-minute meditation. It's a first time for me as a podcast.
It's the secret sauce, yeah.
It's the secret sauce.
Yeah.
And John, how are you doing today, my guy?
Man, I'm good. Had morning with the kiddos. Always fun hanging out with my little people. And yeah, man, the sun is shining even in late October in Lisbon. So very grateful to be here. And you just got off a team retreat in Italy, right, Brianna? How was that?
I did, yeah. We were meeting in Rome. Most of my team's in Central Europe, so it was sort of the path of least resistance to meet there in a beautiful city. But it was great. We're kind of gearing up for a big product launch coming up soon. So just nice to connect with the team, in the world of digital nomadism and decentralization. It's kind of nice actually to have a moment together in kind of 3D.
Yeah, gosh, that is so real. Well, it's beautiful to have this moment, with both of you. And as we go into today, it's going to be fun. We're going to cover, I think, Brianna, maybe some of your story, talk about Reneum, talk about the renewable energy market, and we'll see where that journey sort of takes us. But, why don't we start off actually, Brianna, with maybe could you share a little bit about your own, maybe personal and professional journey in terms of what brought you to Reneum? Would love to hear more.
Yeah. So I spent most of my life kind of itinerantly bouncing around the world. I lived in 12 countries before I was 30. Most of them actually were emerging markets. So I've kind of felt from a young age this kind of visceral responsibility to taking care of other parts of the world, kind of a connection, I guess. Moving to Singapore maybe half a decade ago now, I worked for a renewable energy developer out there, focusing on clean energy access for the ASEAN region. And, after meeting with ministers of environment and ministers of energy and kind of understanding, why aren't you dedicating all your resources to the energy transition? What's stopping you here? You start to really have a lot of compassion for the intricacies and the complexities of the real problems here. A lot of it really comes down to accessing capital and finance. And so prior to, starting in renewables, I spent most of my career in M&A and finance. So, I have a pretty solid understanding of capital markets and just how that machine works. While I was at that company, I ended up working or running their environmental commodities desk. So I was doing everything from, carbon and renewable energy certificate origination all the way through to brokering on behalf of pretty much every ASEAN country outside of Singapore, because those markets actually don't have access to many, or didn't at that time have access to many of the trading registries. And so coupling my kind of personal experience in life with, renewable energy development, understanding really the challenges of the energy transition from a project finance perspective, and then also understanding how environmental commodities markets, which were, originally intended to direct stagnant or kind of misdirected capital to, climate finance, literally to fund projects on the ground, how none of those things were really working. You kind of just can't help but find a solution, or at least build and try to find a solution. So that's kind of how very roundabout and almost unintentional happenstance for me to move into the space. But Reneum was really born out of, an idea of, why can't we use technology to mobilize money, mobilize a wall of money is what we say, actually, mobilize money to the people on the ground who are really building the climate solutions that we actively need. So that's where we started from. And we have had a long journey since then.
Wow. That's beautifully said. I love what you just said there about, how can we mobilize the well of money to bring money and capital to people on the ground that are actually moving forward the climate solutions. I think it's so beautifully said.
Yeah.
What was that, and just to maybe slow down to that leap, what was that leap like to jump, from, being on the desk, being at these, let's say, various companies, to now starting a project from the ground up that's in the space? What was that leap like for you?
Oh, it was a lot of trial and error, I would say. I didn't realize, as a trader, as a broker, you're kind of a pawn in the system in some ways. You're not making the rules of the game. And forgive me if that sounds derogatory. I don't mean it to. It's just the reality. The rules of the game are really, I'll say, were formed with good intentions. And initially, at the 92 Rio Summit, when the carbon markets, for example, were initiated, the purpose was really well-intended and earnest. And I think for, a lot of structural reasons and kind of getting caught up in policy that ends up hampering markets' success and actually meaningfully making a difference, they kind of ended up not necessarily being as successful as intended. And I didn't realize that as a broker, as a trader, until I really started to build in the space. I saw as a broker, I certainly understood the, kind of analog anachronistic models of the transactions that were occurring. The user experience was kind of more like Web 1 than Web 3. Very siloed, opaque registries, a lot of faxing, literally faxing. But that wasn't really the big problem that we faced when we moved into this space. It was more around incumbents really protecting the integrity of their projects and their product, kind of to their own disadvantage, because it's sort of the opposite of the move fast and break things idea, right? It's like let's protect our space to make sure that nobody does damage to it. And that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, if you're an incumbent in the space, I get it. But as an innovator, as a technology developer, someone who sees the problems from the outside and is trying to make a difference, it's really hard to permeate those walls. And I've observed it a lot recently in the carbon space, which is not one that Reneum particularly is involved with, but I've just witnessed it and understand a little bit. Seeing some of the market participants who've been around for 30 years suddenly getting confronted with these technologists who just want to come in and, blow it up and start from scratch. And, I have so much compassion, as I said, for both sides of the fence, because I see both, and so that's been one of our challenges, is really confronting the, existing systems in a way that we work together and kind of symbiotically, rather than just sort of building something that's, trying to disrupt the entire infrastructure that exists currently.
And just stepping back into the framing, I'd appreciate getting your perspective on how energy fits into the big picture of climate change, both the contribution, the size of the problem, and really what we're trying to do in transitioning to renewables and how that looks. Can you give a bit of a big picture framing?
Yeah, I mean, the way I see it, or the way we at Reneum certainly see it, is, the energy transition or the energy sector in general accounts for something like 1/3 of ongoing emissions. So burning of fossil fuels for energy and heat specifically is something that needs to be transitioned fairly rapidly and is one of the most impactful levers we can pull against or in the fight against climate change. So as I mentioned, in my introduction, having worked with a renewable energy developer, understanding, the challenges they face on the ground in accessing finance, the way we look at it is, if we can direct more money and make it more profitable and make renewables more investable, we can kind of make the opportunity cost of going from, black energy to green energy much lighter, much easier. And so Reneum is focusing on what's called the Renewable Energy Certificate or Environmental Attribute Certificate. They're actually the same thing, which is basically like a carbon offset, focusing on only renewable energy. So we issue these certificates or these tokens, in our case, to renewable energy producers. And it represents like the greenness or the green attribute of their energy that they're producing. So that's sold as a commodity, much like a carbon offset is. The point really is to shift money in the direction of renewable energy and focusing on distributing capital to particularly developers in emerging markets where policy in most cases, and certainly subsidies, are really either non-existent or not directly supporting the energy transition quite yet. For many reasons, it's local challenges that they're facing, and it's understandable. But we see private markets as an opportunity to kind of circumvent some of those policy challenges. And so that's where we come in and really thinking, like, if we can get the whole world to green energy, we solve a big chunk of this climate problem. I mean, it's not everything. Obviously, protecting natural forests and ecosystems and all the stuff that carbon focuses on is super important as well. But we're just like a different piece in that pie.
And just going more into like the renewable energy credit itself, I'd love to just unpick this a little bit because I know a lot of ReFi has been focused on carbon to date, and it's a gap in my understanding that I'd love to fill. So let's say, I'm a project developer in India. I found somebody who's got a bunch of land and it's suitable to install a bunch of solar panels. What's the actual process for getting a renewable energy credit? And am I then not eligible to get, carbon credits issued if I'm seeking RECs? Like, are these exclusive assets that are being issued? Like, how does this work in conjunction? Any
producer of renewable energy is entitled to either a carbon offset or a REC. In most markets around the world, though, carbon offsets are no longer being issued to renewable energy developers, particularly not really in Europe and America, at least, and outside of some other countries as well. The idea really is that as a green producer, it's the upfront capital that's required to develop a lot of renewables, particularly solar and wind, is still higher than fossil fuels in many markets. And so even though the energy is cheaper to buy for the end consumer, which is great, obviously, it's not really an economic benefit for a producer to invest extra into renewable energy still. And so RECs are intended to really send a price signal to add like an additional almost subsidy or tariff kind of to renewable producers to make them more financially attractive. So the whole thing really comes down to economics and its incentives. RECs are really considered to be a complementary asset to carbon offsets, though, from a buyer's perspective. So if you're multinational looking to manage your emissions footprint, you would generally buy both a carbon offset and a REC because they address different components of your emissions footprint. So in the terms of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions management, scope 2 is focusing on energy specifically, and energy is addressed by buying a REC. So I see it as actually very complementary overall to the whole space. In terms of how that REC instrument works with a producer of energy. The verification process is similar to a carbon offset. It's a lot of digital MRV work that has to take place. In our case, we physically send engineers to the site of the project that's being certified. We inspect it. We kind of amalgamate a series of data points around that project to make sure it's operating, it's legitimately producing clean energy, all the the good things we need to do. And then we connect the project's monitoring system, like a solar farm, for example, into our database, and we monitor that energy on an ongoing basis in real time. So RECs will be issued one-to-one for the megawatt hours of energy generated. Now, historically, RECs are purchased or are issued only to operating projects, i.e. the project's actually been built. It's currently producing clean energy, and this is more like a subsidy in a sense.
They put the money up front, and now they're getting a subsidy back to to repay that.
The point is to send, particularly to like debt financiers or risk capital financiers, the idea of this market is really to signal to them that they're going to get the return on their upfront capital back sooner. So it's a safer investment. It basically creates a more palatable investment market. However, what Reneum is doing, which is to my knowledge actually quite novel to the space, is focusing on forwards and futures as well. So there's a few carbon projects out there that I'm sure who are doing this in their spaces, and I don't think anyone has done it yet in the REC market. But the idea really is to help to get project financing pre-construction. So when you get into the conversation of like additionality in the carbon markets, it's not actually a concept for the REC market. There's no such thing. There's no requirement. Just considering the nuances of the space. But we believe that the real impact we can provide is actually in helping project developers secure that initial financing and to develop upfront, right? So that's part of our kind of 12-month roadmap, is to really implement those and make that a buoyant market.
Love that. It's super, super cool. And so just to maybe reflect back some of the things, it seems like you've got project developers. Do you guys send staff or engineers to go install what are the devices to be able to measure and monitor?
So there's not a device at the moment.
Cool.
Although we are considering whether we should build one. It's kind of a very complementary but ancillary product to our core kind of thesis. But we would love, if there's anyone out there who's building something already, an IoT device, please call me. It's a big project. No, right now we connect projects' meters or monitoring systems. Cool. So pretty much every renewable energy plant around the world has a monitoring system.
Cool.
Usually they're called a SCADA, but they've got varying different types and technologies and configurations and so forth. And so we work one-to-one with those projects to configure it so that it can transmit data points to our platform. So that process is still, obviously not totally decentralized. We have a human engineer doing that. And it's kind of time consuming because it's bespoke generally. So that's why I'm calling out there if anyone has an Oracle that they've built. I know IOTA is actually planning on building something similar. So we're exploring an idea around that with them, but to be continued on it as to whether that takes off.
Cool. And just briefly, I would love to hear your definition of the two financial instruments of a future and a forward, because I think these are terms that are kind of thrown around in the space from people who know finance better than others. But yeah, can you just kind of decouple those a little bit and say, this is what a future is used for, in this case is what a forward is, and how you guys approach this in terms of the renewable energy space?
Yeah. So if you're not a commodities broker, it's fair you wouldn't know these terms. So a forward contract is a private and customizable agreement. It would be like a bilateral transaction between, Reneum or our projects that we represent and a buyer purchasing long-term. So think maybe Microsoft or Google if they were to buy RECs or carbon offsets, and they want to buy in a 5 or 10 year increment to kind of insulate themselves from the risk of price appreciation over time. Kind of under the expectation that these markets are going to blow up, they're going to boom, we're going to get to 100 billion and it's going to be a whole thing. And if that happens, the price of these instruments is going to go up dramatically, right? Right now, we're looking at somewhere between $2 and $20 for these credits. The projection is that they'll go up to hundreds. And so what a company like Google or Microsoft in that example would do is they basically lock in that price at a predetermined rate now. So they don't risk, it's a hedging risk.
Yeah, by putting capital up front.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they could actually pay year over year, but they will secure the price. It depends on the contract, really, but generally they'll pay a lot of it up front. A futures contract is more like a spot market transaction, so it's like it's taken on an exchange, and prices similarly. You're paying kind of over time, but you're paying for, again, like a previously agreed price, but on an exchange. So it's not like a human is interacting to facilitate that negotiation. That's done on a marketplace. So we actually are building the marketplace to conduct those transactions right now. But it's a little bit more of a complicated business model. So in terms of price discovery and everything, which is what the DeFi and the ReFi and the whole crypto world is excited about. So that'll take a little bit longer to build in.
Super cool. And so with the project developers, right? So there's the issuing of the rec, right? That's happening through the protocol. And then are all of those, I feel like with, carbon credits, for example, sometimes there's like different different credits. There's different sort of like projects that are sort of like that they're reflecting with the rec market and it coming on. Are those then being in the marketplace? Are people going to be able to buy these credits? I'm assuming, right? They're going to be able to buy these renewable energy credits, right? That will then help move capital towards these on the ground projects, correct?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, cool.
So Reneum is what we call non-skeuomorphic, so which basically means it's a digitally native. We're not bridging an off-chain asset on-chain. We're creating an only on-chain asset. So the entire provenance of the project's lifecycle, and by the project, I'm talking about the solar or the wind farm, is basically stamped on chain. And so we, all of the monitoring that we do, so the vetting, the auditing experience is basically tagged to that underlying project on IPFS and in the metadata of the token itself. So end to end, the whole value chain is sort of done on chain. So that allows for a kind of a new level of transparency and kind of data integrity, which hasn't existed before. That is important for the end user because historically speaking, these types of instruments are traded via brokers and multiple kind of intermediaries taking place. So the end user in the historical markets don't really have much visibility into what that project actually does. They get like a kind of a PDF sheet that details the underlying asset, but they don't really have any sense of control or ability or agency to actually look under the hood and kind of do their own KYC. So in our case, the end user is receiving a soul-bound token. It's like an NFT. It acts and behaves like an NFT, except it can't be transferred. The purpose really is is the green certificate that you're owning, and it's a collectible in a sense. And is typically used by companies when they're announcing their emissions management strategies. So the end user will go onto our marketplace. They'll identify the project that they specifically want to fund. They can actually choose. You'll see different tiles of projects on our marketplace. They select them much like any other e-commerce site. Identify the amount of RECs they need, the amount being like the units, the megawatt hour units, and they would put that in their basket and they can check out directly in our platform, in our marketplace. So kind of being a vertically integrated, digitally native system, everything is settled on chain and directly within Reneum's marketplace. So the end user is getting that soulbound token, at least for now. We have a few other features coming in later, which I can talk about, but that's the kind of version 1 version. And they can then conduct their own audit of that project if they wish. I mean, Reneum does bear the responsibility for doing the initial audit process, but they can also do that as well. So that's where we really innovate is both the kind of the digitally native and the vertically integrated piece.
And so let's just open that up a little bit. Like there's a project in Egypt. I want to get 100 megawatt hours worth. So it's 100 RECs, right? And I basically get a soulbound token that represents 100 RECs. And is that then retired as carbon credits are, or is that soulbound token itself the like retirement certificate? Like I just want to understand the kind of credit life cycle.
So what I kind of alluded to, that we have some other features coming out. What's actually happening on the back end in the Renew marketplace when a company or an individual purchases that soulbound token is that Reneum's, what we call our Renew token, RENW, that is the fungible megawatt hour representation of the actual REC. That's actually what's happening in our back end. That token is burnt automatically, representing the retirement. But so the retirement in legacy markets, the retirement feature, the end experience for the user is to receive a certificate, kind of like an award, if you will. And so our certificate is the soulbound token. But what happens behind the scenes is that there's actually a canceling or retiring or burning of the tokens. So they were removed from circulation. They can't be transferred again. That project's 100 megawatt hours that you mentioned are no longer in existence. They can't sell them again. So they can't be double spent. Actually, I think, Simar, you mentioned before, you asked about the funding flows, and I didn't touch on it. Just because this is quite relevant for this part as well. Because everything's on chain, the buyer can actually see where their funds are going directly. So the project itself, the Egyptian 100 megawatt hour, it receives its funds directly on chain into its wallet of choice or its bank account of choice. We're eventually going to be enabled for off ramps into fiat as well. And 90% of the gross transaction value goes directly to them immediately. So there's no kind of questioning of where that money is hiding or whose treasure it's living in. It goes straight to the project.
Wow. With the retiring of the Renew token, is there a fixed supply of Renew token that's then that there's it's being burned from? I'm curious, how does what's the monetary policy here?
Oh, it's tough actually, because we workshopped our tokenomics for 6 months with some very.
So I feel like we're grilling
people.
you. We're just really excited. Like, don't get us wrong.
Sorry, this was not meant to. I'm just like, this is so cool. Like, I'm just very curious. Yeah, this is not meant to be like.
It's honestly, building this has been challenging for the Web3 people in our world, because we don't really follow the regular rules of Web3, tokenomics or anything. There is no finite supply because, that was a choice we made, actually. The reason is, as we bring on more projects to our platform and as projects can perpetually produce more megawatt hours, which they always will do, at least until their, kind of 30-ish year life cycle expires, we want to continue to allow for projects to monetize and to earn revenues. It's kind of meant to be an indefinite revenue stream for them. So there's no finite supply on the Renew token. It is burnt from that project's own inventory, though. So that means that the project itself does have a finite supply in a sense, because they only have as many megawatt hours as they have produced so far in the real world in their physical solar or wind farm. And so that's finite in that sense. In terms of the monetary policy, the purpose of Reneum really is not to create, an inflationary token that, provides yield and APYs and, yield farming kind of options like a lot of other tokens. We're literally meant to be a social signifier. It's like symbolic to your proof of contribution, proof of impact. So for now, we're focusing exclusively on kind of the mechanics in the back end of Reneum, which means that no one can own that Renew token other than the project itself, and they have the option to sell it for on-chain funding.
Super interesting. And just to be clear, are these design decisions reflective of an opinion about like the role of a primary versus secondary market? Because I think some of what I'm hearing from you is reminds me a little bit of what Nori's been doing, where they hold an opinion that it's basically like carbon credit shouldn't be traded. And so they've set up this, token design that kind of tracks the value of a carbon credit. I don't want to go into Nori's stuff, but like in the case of what you've described, if I'm buying 100 megawatt hours worth of credits from a given project, I've got a certificate that shows that those have been burnt, that I'm not then taking it and then trading it, right? Or putting it into a liquidity pool. Like this is a kind of one time, you've done your planet positive action and you get the certificate for it. That's what the marketplace is built for, right?
So I would say this iteration of Reneum right now is exactly Nori's business model for renewable energy certificates. So I read their white paper. I love what they're doing. I think that they have a lot of really solid ideas. I'll say our value proposition is not that we should never be able to monetize and trade these instruments. But the purpose of them is to send money to the underlying projects. So that's our value is really, let's get as much money as possible to the projects themselves. That's the purpose. If we identify a business model where we can leverage DeFi mechanics to further advance that cause, then we might consider doing it. For now, I don't see a huge option. I don't see a clear option for that to take place. I've spent a little time in DeFi, and when individuals start to get returns, that's great, and that encourages them to participate in the space, but it doesn't directly support the underlying cause, right? It's a different use case altogether. So I'm not morally opposed to it or anything. For our purposes, it's just about directing as much money to renewables as possible.
Yeah, super interesting. I think just the key differentiator, which is a design decision you guys have made, which I like, is that the Renew token doesn't have a fixed supply, that this is increasing as you're bringing more credits on chain. Whereas my understanding of what Nori's done is they've got a fixed supply of Nori tokens, which gives, the initial batch of people kind of underlying voucher for carbon tons because it can be exchanged for those actual NRTs. So let's not go too much into tokenomics. I think we keep it a high level here. It's definitely not my expertise, but I think this particular conversation of how do you build a system that does what it exists to do, in this case, drive funding towards, renewable energy projects on the ground, is super interesting. So I feel like we've got a good understanding of your solution. You guys have this marketplace that's driving financing to these projects. Maybe give us a sense of where you guys are actually at and what's coming next, and where you are in your roadmap, if that's helpful.
Yeah, so we will be announcing a few, I think, really exciting strategic partnerships coming up probably in the next 2 or 3 weeks with some large institutions that you definitely know. So that's going to be exciting to look out for that. We are also launching our beta.
Are there any sneak peeks that you can give us? Any teasers?
Simmer's begging for alpha.
I've got a really, really strong NDA with a much bigger company than me and greater access to legal firepower. So I'm gonna keep my mouth shut, but it's gonna be great. I think it'll be the first of its kind. I can say that, and I think it'll be making some waves when it comes out. So keep your ears open for that. But what I can talk about is our beta marketplace coming up, which will be towards the end of November or early December. That's basically going to be sort of like a whitelisting process, if you will, allowing beta testers to come in and trial the platform and share, any constructive feedback, really hopefully honest, candid feedback about the user experience, whether it actually solves a problem we're trying to solve, which is the whole point of it, and kind of how we can improve and iterate. And so the point is going to be to do 1 month of beta testing with a select group of testers for this iteration, and then implement that feedback, and then do another one probably end of January, and then launch fully open to the market following that point. So we're looking for people in the ReFi space who are, obviously digitally native, familiar with the overall market. And so they're not, it's an easy onboarding experience, but also can, really kind of provide poignant recommendations. And what they would get out of that is the early addition or kind of early access to those verified green tokens. I didn't mention this before, but one of the things that we are going to be doing, which is not an economic reward, but is a social signal, social proof reward, is those soulbound tokens can be collected and aggregated, and they represent sort of your total life cycle or total participation in the Reneum economy. And they can then be redeemed or can redeemed for a tradable NFT, which is going to be a different family of NFTs altogether. It's not going to be part of our kind of version 1 I mentioned, because again, we're really just prioritizing on getting funding to renewables. But the idea is that we want to create a kind of a vibrant and robust culture and community around environmental markets in general. So we're looking for ways actually to collaborate with other peers in the space, so probably carbon providers, to see how we can create like a movement around this green economy. This is still very much in kind of development stage, so I don't want to promise too much at the moment, but it's something that we're thinking about. And then also, as I mentioned, we will be integrating the forwards marketplace towards probably the end of next year. So that's sort of, we're in development for that at the moment.
That is super cool. And I think I do think one thing that's amazing is this focus on, hey, let's like really be clean about the value transmission, like great capital to project developers. And then what's on the other side? Great. There's like a social signifier, which I think the NFT is also, or the NTT is super cute. It's the Isa Bear, right? NFT? NTT?
It's pronounced Ice Bear. It's actually German.
Ice Bear, not Isa Bear. Okay, Ice Bear.
That cult song that came out a while ago. Anyway, I won't say, I'll spare you my singing voice. But it's a great, it's just a little polar bear, cult film or cult video from Germany. Anyway, it signifies obviously climate change, but yeah, you get to carry this little soul band token around, and he's pretty cute. And we'll be thinking about ways that we can integrate that on some of the social platforms as well. So that's something that's going to come up probably later next year too. But yeah, kind of a bit of on a tangent in terms of like what you get from as a buyer, obviously companies have vested interest in purchasing these kinds of assets because they need to transition to renewables or carbon neutrality, depending on the instrument they're using. They don't really have a choice in the matter anymore. Individuals don't have that same requirement, that same social pressure still today. But I actually strongly believe, I have a lot of younger people in my life who are, Gen Z, Gen Alphas. So I kind of, have been polling their networks and kind of understanding that these two generations in particular really have a deeply profound commitment to climate. It's almost like they were born with a different programming of their DNA than we were, or at least the 100%. Older generations. I think, you grew up and climate change is such a present, like looming reality for you. You can't help but want to participate. You want to get involved. And so we're betting on the fact that individuals are also going to want to participate in this space, and they're going to care about kind of imbuing and communicating their values along with, around climate and energy and being green and all this stuff. And so we think there's an opportunity really to kind of establish a movement of, climate actioners or people who really want to do good. Think of like the Fridays for Future community. Like these people are literally, so obsessed with the climate, and it's amazing, but protesting for all of its goodness it doesn't actually make a lot of difference long term. It doesn't move the needle in terms of where the money needs to go. And so we think that these social signifiers, kind of symbolic of proof of impact or proof of contribution, can be something that individuals actually buy into as well. And again, kind of focusing on that environmental signal rather than necessarily needing the economic return.
Yeah, I think that's it's something which I'm also seeing too. I think from like a venture capital perspective is like on the individual side, and at least from the institutional side, like there is a greater set of like standards and I think filters for, hey, like measuring your ecological footprint. Of course, I feel like there's been a lot of attention put on what are your carbon emissions going net zero, but it feels like really what we're moving towards collectively is a more expanded understanding of like what our individual and collective ecological footprint is, and then having mechanisms by which we can then offset, right? And be able to like, there's reducing our ecological footprint. And then for the things that we do use, being able to find ways organically, right, to actually fund projects on the ground that are then doing the work to offset, right, whatever we're using from the environment and from nature, right, which is multidimensional in nature, of an energy, which is a huge part.
Yeah. I mean, and I think, the focus on kind of online reputation at least for right now is going to be something that's going to it's going to be something that I think we're going to see a lot more of coming up. Not quite a social credit score system that China has, but something along those lines. And I think anybody who lives in the digital sphere is going to want to participate in that. And so whether by force or by choice, I don't know. But I definitely think that right now people are very confused about what to do in climate. They're often told, don't eat meat, don't fly planes, kind of cull your lifestyle. And that's kind of the only agency that individuals have, or at least that they're told that they have. And, we see it differently. Like, why not give people a tool that they can trust, that they can do their own diligence on? They can make sure they believe in it. They think the cause is valid, and that they think the people behind it, or the broader team committing to it is doing the right thing. And, they can select a company like Reneum. I mean, maybe we won't be the only one, but definitely, one of them, I hope, that people trust and rely on to do what we need to do for climate action. So, yeah, I think giving people access to making a difference is going to be huge, but also giving people trust and credibility, because there's just so much conflicting information out there that, like, as someone who's in the space, who's fairly certain she understands energy and the climate conversation, I read the news and I'm like, what is going on out there? So, I can only imagine that if you're not working in these sectors, it's just like so overwhelming, and you just feel like you're constantly kind of suffering from an onslaught of bad news. And so we want to be a solution in that sense as well.
Definitely. And I think that's really been my heart in ReFi, is just sending the story out to the world that there are very specific things that you can do that can have publicly verifiable impact, and that you can change the world. And it's not just, by dedicating your life for a, multi-decade entrepreneurial journey, but doing simple things like choosing where to spend your money and invest. Yeah. I think like this is a really powerful way to demonstrate what we value. I'd be curious to shift a little bit and just understand kind of your inner journey and what you do to be well amidst all of this. You talked about bad news. You talked about the, dynamics of running a company. I'm curious, like, what are your routines? What's the inside look like? And how is that maybe reflected in the culture at Reneum?
Well, I don't read the actual news ever, which is a good place to start.
Either.
I think I would highly advise for everybody who values their sanity to stop reading the news. I read like curated kind of academic feeds and, financial databases and stuff, but just as much as I need to in order to make sure that I've got a good understanding of what's happening in the world. But I take a lot of timeouts. Our team, has kind of unlimited holidays, actually, officially, as long as we don't have major milestones coming up. We all kind of make an effort, and I think I live this value, and I think I imbue it in the company, or I hope I do at least, that you should have a life outside of your company as well. So while we're working towards a really strong mission, and it's super important to make sure we do this job well, don't terminate the rest of your being for, your company and your mission. I also really don't subscribe to the philosophy of kind of cutting off half of yourself in work. I know, like, I worked in corporate for my first few years of work, and it was almost like I almost had like a split personality in those experiences, which I think is very damaging. If you I studied a lot of, developmental psychology, and, you think of like Freud and Jung and talking about shadow selves and stuff. And that happens when you repress parts of you in certain dynamics. And so I really believe in kind of bringing your whole self to whatever you do. So our team is pretty real. Like we're pretty raw. And I like that. We can have tough conversations. And I think that's really important to just show up in everything, really. In terms of my day-to-day practices, I do a lot of kind of what's called hormesis therapy. So hormesis is basically like a lot of putting stress on any living system, animals, plants, humans, whatever, that helps them to then thrive. It basically activates like an innate body's defense system, which actually helps you to kind of become more sophisticated and healthier. And so things like hot, cold therapies, a lot of physical strength training. I do a lot of meditation and breath work. I'm pretty deliberate about this stuff. So I never go a day without exercising. I'm like religious about it. And I don't know, I think all of that combined from my perspective means that you don't have to sacrifice a lot to work. So work is not like a punishing, laborious experience. It's like, I come to work, like I get to do this. How cool is that?
Yeah. One of the things that also I think you mentioned too in the previous segment that I think is just really beautiful just to highlight was the speaking to the agency piece of like finding agency in everything that's happening, and I think there's many ways to create that. And I think, to what you just said recently, like finding the agency within each day, within each moment to be your best self, and to come back to that and then be able to show up from a place not of threat and scarcity, but from a place of like, great, like this is an overflowing expression of like who I am and what I want to be doing, and I think that's so important.
Yeah, I actually just wrote a piece. I write a lot kind of in my spare time, which I don't have a lot of now, but I try to write as much as I can. And one thing I just wrote about a little while ago, kind of tying in that developmental psychology thing I mentioned to the climate experience we're having, and this whole generation of what they call doomers, people who are just overwhelmed with climate change and either go into like, destructive denial or despair, basically. And it really is a feeling of helplessness and hopelessness. And it's like, I care, but I can't do anything about it. And so, one of the most punishing things you can do to a human mind is to take away their agency. And I think it's really important in this climate fight that we're in right now that we give people agency back, because so often you read in the news that environmentalists are frustrated with companies because companies aren't divesting from fossil fuels fast enough, and governments aren't supporting their policies. And you could talk about it forever. The reality is there's like real challenges that we have to face in the transition to green energy and to net neutrality. Kind of almost independently of each other in some senses. But if people feel that they can participate in that cause and they can join in the movement, it's a whole different existence for people, And so I think that that's something that I personally really care about, is giving people a sense of agency.
And taking that forward, maybe kind of at a systems level, I'd be curious to hear like your kind of projection to the future towards 2030. If Reneum's a great success and this kind of on-chain renewable energy credit market really takes off because of the additional benefits of transparency and price discovery and all these mechanisms, like what are some of the ripple effects that we're going to see in society? You obviously mentioned the energy crisis in Europe. Just kind of give us a lens on best case scenario, the bull case for the energy transition and Reneum's role in it.
Reneum's Renew product, the Renewable Energy Certificate itself, is actually hopefully going to be obsolete by 2030. So, our goal is to put ourselves out of business in that sense. We're a not-for-profit, by the way. So, anybody, we don't have investors who are going to be terrified hearing that. If
I was wondering.
Pardon?
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. It's a shift.
I mean, if we do our job well, we're not going to do this alone, by the way, if we, provide our fracture of support to the market, if we can move into the energy transition by 2030, then we don't need Reneum. That's awesome. Reneum is as a platform, as an ecosystem, will still exist. We're exploring other types of natural capital that we can move into and we could support, whether as the originator of the instruments for the DIA MRV side, or whether as the marketplace, or maybe a combination. But it would definitely, we hope we don't need this token anymore. So that's my optimistic sense. I mean, the energy transition is really difficult. I studied, behavioral economics in school and climate science as well. And it's way harder than it sounds. Energy is the most important asset or commodity to our whole global existence right now. Like you can't do anything without energy. So it's quite integral to the whole net neutrality and climate conversation. As we're seeing with the state of the EU at the moment, not having energy is a big problem. So I think. I'm not 100% confident that 2030 will be green, like ubiquitously green. I don't think that's realistic, but I do think that we can get to a point of, say, 70 to 80% green, and that probably will be sufficient. I think we're going to need, as much as all my environmentalist friends will kill me for saying this, we're going to need petrochemicals for a little bit, at least to facilitate the actual development of the products that are green, right? In order to build solar panels and to build and transport wind turbines, you actually need energy, and a lot of it. And some of those components are made from petrochemicals. So it's not realistic to say just turn off the fossil fuel taps today. But I do think that we can. I'll say overall net, I'm an optimist in the space.
Nice. Yeah, it's an interesting lens that kind of, I don't know, it seems like you've run up against these real world problems and created a more holistic view of what's practical. And I haven't heard, an enemy figure in your narrative. It doesn't seem like you're pointing the finger at a set of bad guys. It's like, this is a complex crisis that we have to address from so many sides. And I wonder, just a little bit, talking around, the kind of market positioning and other people who are coming into this space. You said you can't do this alone. Like, what are you seeing happening around renewables? I've obviously spoken to Nathalie and Dalton at Jasmine Energy, and I think introduced you to William from Helios. And like, there seems to be like a burgeoning interest and enthusiasm in this space. Like, what are you seeing, outside of Reneum, and how this might fit to form the broader picture?
Well, we are, one spoke in the cog. And so we obviously need people who are physically developing the renewables, the inputs for the renewables, and actually deploying them on the ground and operating them. That requires a lot of infrastructure, and it requires a lot of manpower and a lot of money. My wish list, if I could, would be actually infrastructure upgrade, more than getting into the deep tech services like Reneum. Or software programs, more into like hard infrastructure is where we really need to see a big advancement. So things like transmission lines, it's kind of unsexy, to be honest, but it's really real, really need it. If we're going to build up more solar and wind to the point where we can, meaningfully power state grids, we need so many advances in that infrastructure. Like, if you think of a transmission grid as a superhighway, and there's a traffic jam all the time, which is the energy flowing through that transmission grid, there's not any wiggle room to add more cars to that highway right now. We just physically cannot do it. It's not a matter of will, it's a matter of physical constraints. And so we need that. We need a lot of innovation in that space. And that's expensive, it's time consuming. You need generally governments to get behind. So my preference would be we can all work together. We get those developers, we get the policymakers, we get the incumbents in the system, we get everybody together to really kind of conceive of what this sort of new world of energy looks like, because we can't make the energy transition happen with our existing infrastructure. So it's not really related necessarily to the blockchain space at all. Although I think that things like super sensors and data processing through machine learning and Web3 for, settling transactions and managing, base loads on the grid, these kinds of things are really important as well. But generally, it's just, we need more infrastructure. And yeah, just kind of touching back to your point about having a kind of a villain in our story, I don't subscribe to like a philosophy of villainizing people or anybody, really. I don't think that that's very helpful. I think that, the system is a big problem the system we're in is a big problem. It's like the kind of perpetual growth GDP obsession that we've had since the 60s has resulted in extraction and exploitation. And that's just an unfortunate externality, if you want to call it that, of the model that we're in, the economic model. And so there's no one person to punish. It's not necessarily banks' faults or fossil fuel companies' faults. They're just playing the game, And so the way I see it is we have to make the rules of the game easier for them to play and give them better solutions. And so if we can be one of the solutions to help that process, then, that we're doing a great service, I think, to the whole system.
That is so beautifully said. And I think going back to maybe the theme of agency, it feels like there's maybe many layers that we can have, people can contribute, right? There's the capital flows, There's the like, hey, there's clear opportunity to build here, right? Whether it be with your mind in terms of software and things that help, on the sensing side, or any number of things there, down to the literal, like, great, the transmission lines, the physical infrastructure we need to support the green transition. What are other calls to action? What are other ways that people can contribute, and from a place of agency to contribute to, let's say, Reneum, and maybe to the more renewable energy space more broadly? Are there other things that come up?
Well, I mean, the three things you can contribute in general are, money, your network, and your time. Like those are the three kind of categories. And so I would say to everybody, look within yourself and see which of those three you can offer, and find a way to get involved in one of those three. Everybody has at least one of those, I would say. And so, the building and the innovating and the creating is I'm seeing, at least in the ReFi space for sure, in our kind of, echo chamber of builders, is amazing in terms of the innovation that's happening. And it's so exciting. What I don't know if I have seen 100% yet is, how do we pull in the people on the fringe in other markets where this is not native? I spend a lot of time talking to people let's say in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and there's a lot of educational burden still, I would say. Like, people aren't familiar with what I'm talking about, and therefore it becomes a little bit overwhelming, and people kind of just lose interest, and not just with Renew in general or specifically, but in general, the conversation around climate, around energy, everything. It's, these are esoteric kind of, they're conversations that are had usually between people who already know what's going on. And that's actually not that helpful. I mean, while it's great in terms of the what can be built, I think we need to bring in people who are who don't either know the systems or who haven't had an opportunity to participate in them. And that's where I see, DeFi actually being one of the most important movers in the world, actually, that I've ever come across. The ability to reach, the far out corners of the world where people have kind of been systematically forgotten almost. And I think we need everybody in order to make this fight happen. And so, yeah, in terms of just the energy transition piece, like, making the economic decision easier is what I believe is going to compel most companies and governments to make a change. Because if you give them no choice, like you say, imagine there's P&G and Unilever, and they both make the same shampoos, and you go to the grocery store and you've got them next to each other on the shopping aisle, and one of them has a stamp that says, I'm a green energy, buyer, and they're the same price, just for sake of discussion. Almost everyone is going to buy the one that's got the green energy, or whatever, the net neutral, or whatever that stamp of approval is. Almost everyone in the world would make that choice. The problem is, right now, that green energy company is usually costing more. And so most people who are price sensitive, or most companies or countries who are price sensitive, which is most people, they have an opportunity cost in that decision. And so if we can make that easier, we can make the economics work better. I think you remove some of the friction, some of the barriers to some of these transitions. So, that's not really an call to action for individuals specifically, so much as what I just hope we can move forward and understand. I think it would just, that's going to be integral to making all this stuff happen.
Absolutely. Well, it's been such a pleasure hanging out with you, Brianna. I feel as though I understand the world in a different way. You've kind of filled in gaps in my understanding, and I'm really excited to see you guys launch and
Thank you.
To see more of the ReFi movement lean into renewable energy and the REX market. And hopefully people listening can hear the resounding call to action that we need an entire movement of regeneration leaning into this, looking into each of ourselves to say, what are the gifts that we have to offer, and to participate in this symphony. And I think, it's going to be an exciting year ahead. There's some rocky times for sure. But for those listening who want to connect, check out reneum.com, reneum.com, as well as Reneum Institute on Twitter. I see you guys have also got a company page on LinkedIn, and already rocking a sweet team. So hopefully folks can reach out. Anything else you want to leave people with before we say adieu today?
No, I like your term symphony. I think that's a beautifully eloquent way to describe what we need here. Is we need a symphony in this movement. And so I'm really excited that you're part of the movement. Both of you, that you're leading the space. And so we're just looking forward to kind of participating further and moving forward.
Awesome. It was great to get to know you a little, Brianna, and look forward to hanging out in founder circles. And as always, Simar.
Gosh,
likewise.
So grateful for you both. So, this has been so fun today, Brianna. Very, very grateful to have you here.
Cool. Well, likewise, it's been awesome. Really appreciate you both. And I guess till the next time.
Ciao, ciao.